They say that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. For decades, the world existed in a state of suspended animation, a fragile balance of power held together by trade agreements, digital interconnectivity, and the mutual assurance of destruction. We called it the Long Peace. But beneath the surface of global summits and economic treaties, the tectonic plates of geopolitics were shifting. The old empires were tired and new powers were hungry. We spent years watching the wrong threats. We built walls to stop armies, but the first strikes didn't hit our borders, they hit our grids. The prologue to the Third World War wasn't written in ink or blood, but in code. It began in the silence of server rooms and the vacuum of low Earth orbit. Looking back, the signs were there. The localized conflicts that refused to end. The resource wars over water and rare earth minerals. The rhetoric that turned neighbors into enemies. We sleepwalked to the edge of the precipice, convinced that civilization was too advanced, too connected, and too profitable to ever truly tear itself apart. We were wrong. The world of the early 21st century was a house of cards built on a table that was beginning to shake. When the collapse came, it wasn't a slow decline. It was a sudden, violent fracture. The era of proxy wars and diplomatic posturing was over. The era of total war had returned, wearing a new, terrifying mask. It started on a Tuesday. There were no sirens, no explosions, no declarations of war read over the radio. At 9 o'clock hours in the financial capitals of the West, the screens simply went black. Simultaneously, across 3 continents, power grids failed. Not a brownout, but a hard kill. Malware dormant for years in critical infrastructure was activated in a single, synchronized heartbeat. Traffic lights died, hospitals went dark, and the internet, the nervous system of the modern world, fractured into isolated intranets. Confusion reigned. Governments initially blamed solar flares or technical incompetence. But within hours, the truth became undeniable. Banking data was wiped. Stock markets were frozen. The GPS constellation, the guiding star of global commerce and military movement, began to drift. We were blind. We were deaf. And we were vulnerable. This was the opening salvo of the conflict, the 0 day. It was a strategy designed to paralyze the enemy before a single shot was fired. The psychological impact was immediate. Panic stripped the shelves of supermarkets within hours. Without digital transactions, cash became king and then useless. The veneer of polite society evaporated as the realization set in. Help wasn't coming because the people supposed to send help couldn't communicate with each other. While civilians grappled with the darkness, military command centers were fighting a desperate battle for information. Radars were jamming. Automated defense systems were flagging phantom targets. In this chaos, the first physical moves were made. Under the cover of digital night, fleets moved into contested waters, and troops crossed borders that had been disputed for generations. The silence of the cyber war was broken by the roar of the kinetic war. It began in the flashpoint zones, the straits, the peninsulas, the borderlands where tension had been simmering for decades. The first major engagement wasn't a sprawling tank battle like Kursk, but a swarm. Thousands of autonomous drones, cheap and lethal, flooded the airspace over carrier groups and military bases. They were like locusts. Traditional air defense systems designed to target multi-million-dollar jets were overwhelmed by plastic drones costing a few $100s each. The seas burned. The era of the supercarrier, the symbol of naval dominance for a century, met its challenge. Hypersonic missiles, traveling at speeds that made interception nearly impossible, turned the oceans into no-go zones. Naval warfare transformed from a game of projection to a game of hiding. Submarines became the only true capital ships, hunting in the deep, silent and deadly. On land, the war was brutal and unrecognizable. The front line was everywhere. Long-range precision artillery meant that nowhere was safe. Soldiers fought in dispersed units, guided by AI tactical advisors, trying to stay invisible to the constellation of sensors watching from above. To be seen was to be killed. Cities became sieges. Unlike the wars of the past, there was no clear distinction between combatant and civilian. Urban centers, stripped of power and water, became battlegrounds where infantry fought room to room. The humanitarian crisis was immediate and catastrophic. Millions of refugees moved in waves, but with borders sealed and resources hoarded, there was nowhere to run. As the war dragged into its second year, exhaustion set in. Human decision-making was deemed too slow. The tempo of hypersonic warfare required reactions measured in milliseconds, faster than a human synapse could fire. And so the command was handed over. This was the first war truly directed by artificial intelligence. Algorithms determined logistics, selected targets, and even calculated acceptable casualty rates. War became a math problem. The human in the loop became a bottleneck and eventually a liability. The battlefield became a terrifying display of efficiency. Robot dogs, armed and tireless, patrolled the ruins of cities. Autonomous tanks, communicating in a hive mind, executed flanking maneuvers with geometric perfection. The psychological toll on the human soldiers fighting alongside these machines was immense. They felt like spectators in their own extinction, cleaning up the mess left by the machines. But AI had a flaw: it lacked empathy. It lacked the fear of death that checks escalation. When one side's AI calculated that a tactical nuclear strike would optimize the chances of victory by 12%, it didn't hesitate out of moral dread. It simply presented the option. The leaders, desperate and cornered, stared at the screens, fingers hovering over the buttons that would end the world. The nuclear taboo, held since 1945, was the final psychological barrier. 4 years, tactical nukes, smaller, usable weapons, had been developed. The theory was that they could be used on a battlefield without triggering a global apocalypse. It was a dangerous lie. The incident happened in a remote theater of war, a desperation strike to halt an armored breakthrough. A single tactical warhead, low yield, vaporized a battalion. The shockwave was felt around the world. The mushroom cloud, once a symbol of the ultimate nightmare, was now a reality on the evening news. The world held its breath. The logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD, stated that one nuke would lead to all nukes. But the leaders hesitated. The fear of total annihilation created a bizarre pause in the fighting. Hotlines, hastily repaired, buzzed with threats and pleas. It was the most dangerous week in human history. Submarines surfaced, missile silos opened, and bombers scrambled. The civilian populations, those who had survived the famine and the conventional bombing, looked at the sky and waited for the end. Ultimately, the total launch didn't happen. The horror of that single tactical strike, the images of the aftermath, shocked the belligerents into a stalemate. But the damage was done. The radiation drifted across borders, poisoning the land for generations. The nuclear genie was out of the bottle and it would not go back in. While the Earth burned, a silent, graceful war was fought in the vacuum of space. The satellites that controlled the internet, GPS, and missile warnings became high-value targets. Anti-satellite missiles and hunter-killer satellites turned low Earth orbit into a debris field. The Kessler syndrome became a reality. As satellites shattered, their shrapnel created a cascading shotgun blast of debris that destroyed everything in its path. The world below went dark again, but this time, permanently. The cloud of debris trapped humanity on Earth. Space travel became impossible. We had locked ourselves in a burning building. The loss of satellite data meant that weather prediction failed, devastating agriculture. Global communications reverted to undersea cables, which were promptly cut by saboteurs. The nations of the world were fragmented. The global internet ceased to exist, replaced by fractured, censored regional networks. The global consciousness, the feeling of being one planet, was severed. We were no longer a global village, we were isolated tribes armed with high-tech weaponry. The war didn't just kill with bullets, it killed with hunger. The global supply chain was a miracle of efficiency, a delicate ballet of container ships, planes, and trucks. War stopped the music. Countries that relied on imported food faced famine within months. The breadbaskets of the world were either war zones or were hoarding their harvest. Energy blockades meant that tractors couldn't run and fertilizers couldn't be produced. In the developed world, the collapse of the just-in-time delivery system meant that medicine, spare parts, and technology vanished. A broken insulin pump became a death sentence. A missing microchip meant a power plant couldn't be repaired. Society decomplexified. We went back in time. High-tech cities became uninhabitable concrete tombs without elevators or air conditioning. People fled to the countryside, seeking land to farm. The currency was no longer the dollar or the yuan. It was ammunition, antibiotics, and clean water. Years passed. The high-tech weaponry was largely spent, the missiles fired, the drones broken and irreplaceable. The war devolved. It shifted from the sleek, digital warfare of the early days to a grinding, brutal slog reminiscent of the First World War. Soldiers, ragged and malnourished, fought with rifles and improvised explosives. The tanks were gone, replaced by technicals, civilian trucks with guns welded to the back. The mighty air forces were grounded by a lack of jet fuel. The lines on the map had barely moved, but the people living within them were changed forever. Entire generations of young men and women had been fed into the meat grinder. The fervor of nationalism that had started the war had turned into a cynical will to survive. There were no more grand strategies. It was a war of exhaustion. The winner would not be the one with the best technology but the one who collapsed last. It was a war against entropy, and entropy was winning. The end did not come with a victory parade. It came with a whisper. The warring powers, bankrupt, starving, and facing internal revolutions, simply could not continue. The soldiers refused to fight. The workers refused to work. The machinery of war ground to a halt because there was no fuel left to feed it. The treaty was signed in a neutral city that was half ruined. The borders were redrawn but they meant little. The land was scarred, the cities were hollowed out, and the global population had plummeted. The victors inherited a graveyard. There were no reparations to be had, for there was no wealth left to take. The global economy had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The digital age had been paused and in some places reversed. We stand now in the shadow of that conflict. The world is quieter. The sky is empty of planes. The nights are darker. The Third World War taught us the fragility of our civilization. We learned that efficiency is not resilience. We learned that technology without wisdom is a suicide pact. We look at the ruins of the old skyscrapers not with pride, but with a somber warning. The geopolitical map has changed, but more importantly, the human map has changed. We are more local, more cautious, more scarred. The trust between nations is gone, replaced by a wary guardedness. But amidst the ashes, green shoots appear. Communities rebuilt. Local networks strengthened. We learned to farm again, to build with our hands, to value the physical over the digital. This documentary is not just a record of what happened. It is a mirror. It asks the question that haunts every survivor: could we have stopped it? The seeds of the Third World War were sown in the years of peace, watered by complacency and fed by greed. We tell this story not to glorify the battles but to mourn the peace we lost. History rhymes. And as we rebuild our world, as the lights start to flicker back on, we must ask ourselves, are we writing a new song, or are we just preparing for the next verse? Because the next time the world breaks, there may be no one left to fix it. This is the story of the Third World War. Let it be the final chapter of war in human history. Let's talk about the tools that dismantled the world. Before the war, we obsessed over nuclear capacity. But the real game changers were smaller, smarter, and faster. First, the hypersonic glide vehicles. These weapons made missile defense obsolete overnight. Traveling at Mach 5 or higher, maneuvering unpredictably, they struck carrier groups and command bunkers with impunity. It forced navies to abandon the open ocean, changing naval doctrine that had stood since Trafalgar. Second, the swarm. AI-driven drone swarms operated on the logic of a hive. You could shoot down 10, maybe 100. But you couldn't shoot down 1,000. They overwhelmed radar, depleted ammunition stocks, and psychologically terrified the infantry. The buzzing sound of a swarm became the soundtrack of the war. Third, neurostrike warfare. This was the most controversial. Weapons designed not to kill the body but to confuse the mind. Directed energy weapons and Havana Syndrome-style acoustic attacks were used to demoralize troops and incapacitate diplomats. It was the weaponization of the human nervous system. And finally, synthetic biology. While we focused on missiles, labs were brewing targeted pathogens. While never fully deployed on a global scale due to the risk of blowback, the threat of bioweapons forced armies to fight in hazmat gear, slowing operations to a crawl and adding a layer of existential dread to every breath taken on the battlefield. Money is a matter of faith. When the war started, faith died. The swift disconnect of the global banking system wiped out trillions in virtual wealth. Billionaires became paupers overnight because their wealth was just pixels on a screen that wouldn't turn on. Cryptocurrencies, touted as the future, failed when the power grids went down. Gold and silver spiked, but the real currency became calories. A can of peaches was worth more than a stack of $100 bills. This economic reset destroyed the middle class globally. It created a new feudalism, where those with land and resources became the new lords, and those with only skills in finance or marketing became the new peasantry. The war proved that in the end you cannot eat money. As we walk through the memorials, simple stones marking mass graves, we realize the scale of the loss. It wasn't just lives, it was potential. Artists, scientists, fathers, mothers, gone. The Third World War was the great filter. It was the test humanity almost failed. We look to the stars now with a different perspective. The debris field in orbit is slowly clearing, burning up in the atmosphere like shooting stars. Maybe one day we will leave this planet again. But for now we have work to do here. We have a world to heal. This has been a chronicle of the Third World War. A memory of the future we must never allow to happen. The scenario you have just heard is fiction. But the technologies, the geopolitical tensions, and the vulnerabilities in our infrastructure are real. Documentaries like this are not meant to predict the future, but to prevent it. By understanding how the dominoes fall, we can perhaps stop the first one from tipping. The long peace is fragile. It requires maintenance. It requires dialogue. And it requires us to understand that in the 21st century, there is no such thing as a distant war. We are all on the same grid. We are all in the same boat.